Welcome to Staying Connected, a podcast where I talk to people about their stories with VEDS, Marfan, Loeys-Dietz, and related vascular and aortic connective tissue conditions. The views, information, and opinions in this podcast are those of the individuals involved, and the information presented does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Welcome back. Today, we're going to talk to Ryan Rodarmer, the director of the VEDS Movement, about his personal experience with aortic aneurysm and dissection, and his career as a genetic counselor working with connective tissue conditions and vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome prior to his role at the Marfan Foundation. Heads up, in this episode, we'll talk in detail about Ryan's experience with aortic dissection and multiple surgeries. Before we jump into the interview, if you like this podcast and you want to support our community and our efforts to raise awareness through this show, you can buy merch in my Printify pop-up store, make a one-time donation, or support the show by joining my Patreon. This show wouldn't be possible without the continued support of my Patreon subscribers and donors, so if you've already been supporting the show, thank you. Check out the episode show notes for links to ways to support the show. Let's go to the interview with Ryan. Hey, Ryan, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast to share your story with aortic dissection and your career and everything. I mean, people listening, in case you didn't know, Ryan is the new director of the VEDS Movement as of like a year ago now, right? Is that right?
A year and a half, May of 23.
Oh, my goodness. Well, go ahead and introduce yourself to people who don't know you.
Great. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Ryan. I am, as Katie said, an aortic dissection survivor. Quite an interesting journey that has kind of brought me to where I'm at as the director of the VEDS Movement. I actually was in graduate school to become a genetic counselor and didn't have any genetic conditions in my family that I was aware of. And all of a sudden was on a table in the hospital room, being told that I had an aortic aneurysm. And sort of the path of my career has been very much influenced by that moment. I have a wife and 2 children and cute little doggo. I know that you're a big fan of pets. So, yep, she's wonderful. She lays by my feet the entire time that I'm working for the Marfan Foundation. And so that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. I'm so glad that you're coming onto the podcast to help our VEDS community and generally our broader community get to know you better and share your story. Do you want to start with your aortic surgery? Like, how did all of this come about?
Yeah. So like I said, I didn't know that my genetics would impact my life in any way but career. So I always loved genetics. But I remember thinking back in graduate school, this was longer ago than I would like to admit, but there wasn't a whole lot known about these conditions back then, but we did have a small section on Marfan syndrome. And I remember as we talked about some of the features of that condition, I remember saying to my instructors, like, my measurements are off, like my proportions are off, and I've got this and that, and I don't look the part of someone who has Marfan syndrome, really. And so there was a lot of, it's an interesting thing about graduate students as they learn about conditions. It's very easy to convince yourself that you have everything that you talk about. And so they kind of assumed that's what was happening. And over a period of probably 4 or 5 months, I lost a considerable amount of weight. So I'm 6'1". I got down to like 140 pounds. I was drilling a new hole in my belt like once a week to keep my pants up. And and I was stressed with school. I was not feeling very well, but nothing like enough to warrant going into the hospital. But there reached a point where one day I woke up and it just all hit me. I felt like I'd been hit by a Mack truck. So I went into the hospital. It turns out it was a heart infection. So I had endocarditis. And that came from a nasty mitral valve that I had at the time. That was the cause of that. But while they were doing the imaging to look at the mitral valve, they incidentally found that my aortic root was enlarged as well. So I was 22 at the time. My aorta measured somewhere between 4.4 and 4.6 centimeters at age 22. And not a lot was known. So, I was told surgery immediately. And then I talked to some more experts, and they said, well, no, we're going to watch and wait. It's not time to do surgery for you yet, because I didn't have a known syndrome or anything at that
Right.
time. And guidelines have changed in the meantime as well. So I was treated for a number of weeks for my heart infection. And then I finished up graduate school, and I knew I wanted to work with families that had inherited heart issues at that point, because while I didn't have a known syndrome, while I didn't have a known family history at that point, there really wasn't any other explanation besides something genetic for a 22-year-old to have such a large aortic root aneurysm. So I knew that heart was where my heart was, no pun intended. It's definitely what I wanted to do. And so I worked with families for almost 17 years with inherited heart conditions, from cardiomyopathies to arrhythmias and sudden death with regards to cardiac arrest, to what was very near and dear to me was my connective tissue families, practicing here in West Michigan. And the VEDS community particularly, I grew very close to, and I knew that that community particularly needed a voice at the hospital, needed to make sure that our providers were easily accessible when someone with VEDS came in the emergency department, that our messaging was very clear with regards to what they needed to do when they came in. They needed to get imaging immediately and all of those things. So anyways, for almost 17 years, I practiced as a genetic counselor, and my heart was stable for quite some time. In 2013, I went out to Los Angeles for a conference, and I thought I was having like an ocular migraine or something, but my vision in my right eye was coming and going a little bit. And I was told not to fly home, and like most guys, I didn't listen to the medical provider, and I flew home, and I went immediately to the emergency department, and there had been some further damage to my mitral valve, and so I'd had a blood clot go from my mitral valve to my right eye and cause some permanent vision loss there. But it was while I was in the hospital, I was on the neurology floor. They were monitoring me for a stroke, and they went to send me home. They said everything's stable, no evidence of a stroke. You lost vision in your right eye. There's nothing we can do about that. I said, well, what did my cardiologist say? And the neurologist said, well, we haven't talked at all to your cardiologist. And I said, so the source of this clot was my heart, undoubtedly. And you haven't talked to my cardiologist. I said, I'm not leaving until you at least do like a bedside echocardiogram. And that was sort of very early in this journey where I realized, like, I need to speak up for myself.
Yeah, and you knew about the aorta and aortic dissection as a risk because, one, like you had a known aortic aneurysm, but you had also worked with patients who have this kind of connective tissue disorder where it affects the aorta or the vascular system.
Yeah, and honestly, so I'd been getting imaging on my aorta all along, and it was possibly slowly growing. Depends on who you talked to at the time. Many said, "Oh, it looks like it may be stable." We have different radiographers looking at it. It's possible that maybe it hasn't grown, and I got different answers from different people, but I knew that something had to be going on with that valve. Like, I wasn't concerned about my aneurysm being a cause for the blood clot and the vision loss, but clearly something was going on with the valve if it's causing those, because I was on blood thinners. It should not have happened. Right. And so, that was 2013. They did the bedside echo. Immediately, my cardiologist was there bedside and said, "Yeah, we got to get a surgery on the books to repair your mitral valve." And so that December 2013, I had what was supposed to be a very low risk robotic surgery to repair the mitral valve. And before I did so, though, that is when I actually did my clinical genetic testing. And I had some suspicions about what that might look like when it came back, but to my surprise, they didn't find anything. So it was a little bit of a smaller test back then. I think they looked at 16 different genes, and depending on where you get testing today, there are a large handful more genes that they would look at today with that. But no evidence of, not even anything uncertain. It was completely, I don't like the word negative. It was completely uninformative. It didn't help, right? So, but it did help in that while they repaired the mitral valve, they decided not to tend to my aneurysm quite yet. If I'd had a known syndrome and at the size that the aneurysm was, they probably would have done open heart surgery and repaired the aneurysm. Instead, they opted to do this quote unquote low risk robotic surgery. which actually ended up not going so great. So I had an artery in my rib cage that was not even anywhere near where they went in, spontaneously rupture during the surgery. I was obviously not awake for this, but apparently the nurse was calling my wife every 30 minutes all night long saying, we can't find the source of the bleeding. We've given him a lot of blood. We don't know that he's going to make it. And so I always chuckle, or I say, quote unquote, low risk when I'm describing that surgery, because it ended up being very risky surgery. So what was supposed to take like 6 hours, I was under for about 24.
Oh.
Yeah. And when I eventually woke up, I mean, obviously I was clueless as to what my wife had gone through during that time. We had a new little baby at home, and she's at home thinking like, I'm going to be raising her without a father. I'm tearing up a little bit as I say that. So that was, it didn't go as planned. And I think around that time, my work as a genetic counselor started to grow a little bit more difficult. And I'd been stable up to that point. So it was really easy not to let some of my own opinions and biases work their way into my counseling of patients. But now I'd faced like a pretty major complication with it all. And it was starting to grow a little bit harder to counsel those families. However, I knew that there really wasn't someone that would be better at it than me. Like I could, completely empathize with them, and I knew what types of things they needed to hear from me because I had been sitting in their shoes. Yeah. So I kept plugging away for quite some time. Aneurysm continued to slowly grow, except for the occasional provider that would line them all up and say, like, I don't think it has. It did. It was funny. It was funny how I'd always get a different answer from depending on who I was talking to. And so they would instill hope, and then they would take it away, and then I would schedule a surgery, which I really wanted. I wanted to do a preventive surgery. I didn't want to wait until I wasn't scared of getting a planned preventive surgery on my aorta. I'd already been through a surgery that was very complicated. I don't think it could really go worse than the first one did, honestly. So I wanted to get that done. And I had multiple heart surgeries scheduled to repair my aorta, and then it would get canceled because the radiologist would come in and say, I don't think we're quite there. The risk of surgery outweighs the risk of just waiting. They waited too long. So in 2019, I knew the moment it had happened, exactly what had happened. I'm not super proud of this part of the story, but I had walked down the stairs. I was getting my daughter some frozen pancakes for breakfast before school. So that's like the non-nutritional part of the story. That's what was happening. I was giving my daughter some horrible breakfast. But I reached for the freezer door, and suddenly there was just extreme pain in between my shoulder blades. This is Spinal Tap. It was 11 out of 10. And I knew exactly what had happened. My first thought was like, this is not what I was told it would feel like, though, because you hear a lot about like a tearing and ripping sensation. Yeah. It was more like a large person was just like burying their fist in between my shoulder blades. It was constant. It was very hard pressure, and I grew very short of breath. And I because the onset was not gradual, it was in a moment. It was in an instant that I felt that pain. I knew exactly what had happened, and so I did end up hand delivering the frozen pancakes upstairs because my daughter still needed breakfast. I'm a dad. That's what dads do. Yeah. But I looked up at my wife and I said, "It happened." I crawled over to the couch. I knew I had to stay calm, which is a very difficult thing to do when you know very well the risks that you're facing. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to stay calm in that moment. But if I'd gotten upset, that would have meant a spike in blood pressure. That would have meant odds go even lower, right? So I laid on the couch. I called the cardiology nurse that I worked with to say, I'm not going to be in today. I think there's a patient on my schedule, so I'm sorry that you're going to have to work to reschedule that person. I really apologize, but the ambulance is on the way. I'm quite certain I dissected. She said a quick prayer with me over the phone, and then when we hung up, she immediately went to work. She called the cardiologist that was rounding. She called the cardiothoracic surgeon that was rounding at the hospital, and I didn't know she was doing all of this, but they were there waiting for me when I arrived, which is kind of a little bit of an unfair advantage that I had, I guess, but and maybe that's part of the reason why I didn't consciously make the decision to work in cardiology, but like deep down that worked out pretty nicely for me to have those connections. Not everybody has that sort of advantage, but they were there waiting for me. One of the things that I'm super passionate about is educating pre-hospital providers, so EMTs, firefighters, paramedics. I don't think that there are many people that were like as well equipped to explain to a paramedic what was going on, what I had. I mean, I told the paramedic I measure 5.2 centimeters. It's right at the sinus of Valsalva. Like there were all these things that I could not have been more clear what was happening and what the risks were. And when the paramedic got on the phone with the hospital, they were using terms like, I have a young man who thinks he's got a AAA, and I'm stopping him and saying, no, AAA is abdominal aortic aneurysm, and while that is a risk as well, it's not as high of a risk. And I need you to hear me when I say we're talking a type A dissection.
Yeah.
And I don't think I have one. I have a very large aneurysm that surgery is probably not too far around the corner. Like, this is what's happening right now. They didn't turn the lights on immediately when we got into the ambulance. My wife rode in the front seat and she worked on them, and eventually they turned them on. But, it's just really interesting. Like I had mentally prepared for that moment. And what am I going to say? And how can I be as clear as possible? And I still found myself having to stop, correct, educate. Yeah. It was very frustrating.
Yeah, for sure. You're obviously, so you're here. So that surgery was successful.
That surgery went really well. They were able to spare my aortic valve, so I don't need to worry about, I do take Plavix, so I am on a blood thinner just because I don't trust that aspirin's going to do what it needs to do. I was taking daily aspirin when I had that blood clot go to my eye. Yeah. So I am on Plavix, and that was because I loudly said I'm not going to be on nothing. Like I do want to continue to be on a blood thinner. But I don't have a mechanical valve or a bovine valve or anything in there. It's my aortic valve, which is really cool. So the surgery went really well. I was training at the time to run a 5K, and it was 7 weeks after my dissection. I ran the 5K. I will admit, actually, even when I'm at my healthiest, my 5K time is horrendous. So I wasn't out there setting any records for sure. And a friend of ours actually got a T-shirt that said "Still got it," and it had like an EKG reading on the chest.
I love
that I wore. But I will admit, it definitely made the race volunteers very nervous as I jogged by to see like this T-shirt that said I still got a heartbeat. I was back at work. They said 3 months off. I was back after, it was probably about 6 weeks or so. I was back. There were families that needed me, and it was a desk job. I couldn't justify, like if I baled hay or something for a living, that's a different story, obviously, but I was sitting at a desk, and I was in pain, but, my families needed me to be there for them. That's what I convinced myself of, and so I was back at work right away. But after surgery, and people that have had an open heart surgery will know what I'm talking about, is after open heart surgery, you can really feel and hear your heartbeat. It's very prominent. And my doctors continued to say, well, you'll get used to it. You'll get used to it. I wasn't getting used to it. And in fact, there was a point where I was quite certain it was worsening as opposed to being something that I could live with, right? So, and I would ask some of the doctors I work with, and they would take a listen with their stethoscope, and everything sounds great. Well, I pushed really hard to get my imaging moved up. And one of the curses of an electronic medical record is I saw the result before my doctor called me. I saw the word pseudoaneurysm, and I'm like, what is going on here? And I looked really closely at it, and my wife is like, stop looking at that. Wait till the doctor calls. You are not allowed to look at this. But I knew what I was seeing. The graft had failed, and so I had developed a new aneurysm, like at the site of that leak where the aortic graft was, and the aneurysm was actually between my aorta and my chest wall, so it was like right up against my breastbone, which explained why it was beating so hard. Like my wife lay on the opposite side of the bed 4 or 5 feet away, and could feel it shaking the bed all night long, every single beat. It was just like resonating through my clavicles. Like it was really bad. And so then all of a sudden I knew why. So we needed to schedule another open heart less than a year and a half after the first, to go in and repair the graft that had failed. And it's like, that's not the way that this was supposed to go. I was so frustrated. I'd not only survived a type A dissection, but I'd finally gotten that surgery in the rearview mirror. This surgery that I had actually looked forward to, interestingly, for so long, was finally behind me. And here I am scheduling another one, like not too long after the first. I was angry. I was so angry. And I knew I was in good hands. Great doctor. I actually got a second opinion from a colleague of my surgeon, who is another cardiothoracic surgeon down at University of Michigan that I'm very fond of. And, he agreed that the plan for surgery was exactly what he would do. So I had all that confidence going in, and the surgery actually went extremely well. And in fact, I woke up, I was super with it. A nurse in the room was actually a friend of the family, and, we were making jokes. And all of a sudden I said, boy, I'm as blind as a bat. And it was like record scratch, like, ee! The room just came to a standstill, like, stop, silence. What did you just say? I said, it's dark. It's so dark in here. Can you turn the lights on? Well, I intimately got to know the stroke team at that point, because the lights obviously were on in the room. It was silly of me to think otherwise. I'm being hauled all over the hospital, getting imaging done, trying to figure out why my vision was gone. A bunch of neurologists came into the room, and I chatted with them, and they admitted they're not sure why that had happened. They couldn't tell me whether or not I would get my vision back. That was super scary. Like, we'd had some scares during surgery before, but I slept through them. And now all of a sudden I'm super aware of like what my wife had been through during all of these previous complications during surgery. I'm wide awake for this one, and it was frightening. It was during COVID, so they sent her home. She couldn't stay with me. Our house has multiple flights of stairs. She's like, all of these thoughts running through her head. We can't continue to live here. He can't see. My husband doesn't have vision now. And it was really scary. Number one, being told that they're not sure if it's going to come back, but I love explanations. I like answers. And for the doctors to say, like, we can't even tell you why you lost your vision. Like, there was no evidence of stroke. It was frightening. Fortunately, about 12 to 14 hours later, it's kind of started to gradually come back. First, I could see some shadows, and then they would hold up signs, and I wouldn't confidently answer, but they would say, like, what image am I showing you? And I would make an educated guess on what I was seeing. And then, like 14 to 16 hours later, my vision was fully back. But that was super frightening.
Yeah. Did they ever like come up with a theory of what happened there? So
my surgeon, a couple of years later, decided it would be a good time to tell me, like, oh, yeah, that happens every once in a while. And, like, it would have been great to tell me that at the time, right?
Oh, my gosh.
But, they don't fully understand it, but it is a thing. Okay. I think it has to do with, like, pressures and hemodynamics and all sorts of stuff within those vessels and things that are way above my head. I went to school for genetics, not physics. But yeah, I think that has something to do with it. And apparently it is a thing that happens like to one patient at our hospital system per year.
Oh.
And generally tends to come back. But I was like, yeah, that would have been great to know in the moment.
Would have been a little bit maybe reassuring that it's not the first time it's ever happened. Yeah. So that was in 2020 that you had that surgery?
2019 was the aortic dissection. 2021. February of 2021 was then my most recent heart surgery. And I took my 3 months that time. It was the first time I'd ever taken the amount of time that they said I was allowed. And when it was time to go back to work, I couldn't do it. And so at the time I was talking to a therapist, and that I think, tending to our mental health is something I put off far too long, and it's something I strongly advocate for. That bought me a couple of more months because I was talking to a therapist. The therapist said he's not in any place to go back to work. And so I took a couple of more months off. And then when I did go back to work, it was like it was like professional athletes farewell tour, like where they go to each stadium and I went back knowing I was done. Mm-hmm. I went back knowing like I'm at least going to take some time away from medicine because it was just so hard to, I think what I really feared is, and I saw it happening, biases that I had developed that were my own were coming out as I talked to families, or if I saw somebody not taking their risks seriously enough. I'd been the less than the 1% now multiple times. And I found myself getting angry with people who weren't taking things as seriously as I thought that they should be taking them. Mm-hmm. And it's just, that's horrible for genetic counselor practice. Like that's a big no-no, obviously. And so I knew when I went back that I was at least going to take a pretty considerable amount of time off. I immediately reached out to some families that I'd grown very close to. There were some families where I'd made an initial diagnosis, but then I'd gotten to know them very well as they brought in each of their children as their children were born to be tested. And, so there were a lot of families that I really grew close to who some of them knew a little bit about the fact that I was on a similar path. Some of them didn't know at all, but I took some time to reach out to all of those families that I really just absolutely adored. And honestly, like I was apologizing. I was like, you may not know this, but I'm going through this and I am sorry, but I don't know that I can be here for this. Yeah. And I introduced them to colleagues and I knew they were in good hands with my colleagues, but, that was the hardest part in leaving medicine, was knowing that I couldn't be there and be the voice for particularly, the families that I'd grown to love, that were living with VEDS.
What drew you to the families with VEDS? Or like, what drew you to VEDS, I guess is...
Yeah. I think because the condition is not super well known, because it was very regularly getting confused with hypermobility spectrum, I just knew that this was a community that really needed somebody loudly advocating for them, especially in the emergency setting. And then also, I was a very new graduate when I first counseled a family with VEDS. And while the father was deciding whether or not he wanted to pursue genetic testing, we weren't aware that he was doing this, but he had our surgery and passed away on the table. And so it was really, I don't know that I was mature enough as a new graduate and, in my middle 20s. I think emotionally men eventually mature to the point where they can handle that type of stuff. Maybe they're around age 42 or so. And I was in my mid 20s. It was a big wake up call with regards to what this condition can do to a family. I had to grow up very quick, but it was as a result of that I saw the importance of loudly educating and advocating for individuals from the VEDS community. So yeah, that was the hardest part about leaving medicine. Yeah. Was not being there for my VEDS families, I'm going to be honest.
So you left in 2021.
Yeah.
How much time did you take off? And how did that, obviously you're the director of the VEDS movement now. Yeah. Right. So how did that come about for you?
So I took about a year off. I did some stuff that was completely a 180, completely unrelated to medicine, genetics. Hated every minute of it. About a year in, there was just a day where I woke up. So I'll tell you what I was doing. I was day trading stocks, and I actually had gotten pretty good at it. But there was a day I woke up and I just felt gross. Like I was defining how successful I was that day by how much money I made. And, bills have taken away that money. Don't think that you're talking to anyone rich at this point. But, there was a day that I woke up and I just felt gross. And I felt that I had wasted some time, between, my experience and my education, but then also walking that path myself. There was a day I woke up and I was like, I have no business doing anything but giving back to the connective tissue community in some way. That said, I was very afraid. I'd also gone a year without those triggers in place. Am I going to be able to, though? This is what I should be doing. That's pretty clear. Perhaps that's the reason why I'm here. However, am I going to be able to do it? And so I actually took on a project manager role in part-time, working with providers, helping to educate cardiology providers about the genetic testing process, specifically for families that have inherited heart arrhythmias. Loved the work. I really loved what I was doing. It's the first I'd ever really worked for a nonprofit. Like, technically, our hospital system is a nonprofit organization as well. But first I'd ever worked with like any sort of advocacy group or anything like that. I loved it. It was not triggering any of my PTS stuff. And I was gaining confidence, like I can do this, you know? And I knew that was kind of a short-term project. It was part-time, you know, after having taken a pretty considerable amount of time off of work. Like, I knew that at some point it was time for me to be like full-time, gainfully employed once again. You know, and so then I saw this position open up, one that you might be a little bit familiar with. And, you know, I literally dropped everything that I was doing and just poured my heart into a cover letter. And, you know, there's a funny story at the foundation that they actually initially thought I was a bot. Because like I had web design experience and I was a genetic counselor and an aortic dissection survivor so they didn't, at first luckily I was persistent because at first they didn't think I was
That's
a real
hilarious.
person. But yeah, and you know, the rest is history, but I absolutely love what I'm doing for the foundation. But you know, one of the things that, like, as I tell the story, one of the things that I really kind of wanted to key in on was with regards to like my uninformative genetic test.
Yeah, I was about to go there with your family history and like your genetic testing.
Yeah, let's do
and
that.
How you handled that information. Like, okay, on the one hand, you have this genetic test that was, you know, quote unquote clean. It covers 16 genes, right? But it's quote unquote clean. It's non-informative. But you also have an aortic aneurysm, an aortic dissection, and then a pseudoaneurysm following your graft. Like, how did all of this come together for you, and how did that combine with your family history? And take me through that.
Yes, it's super complicated, and I'll start out by saying, because it is quite complicated, I'll be honest. There was a point where I was tired of having to explain to medical providers why I didn't have Marfan syndrome. It was exhausting. Like, when I was going into, if I was talking to a physician bedside when I was hospitalized, or if I was going in to see a new provider that hadn't seen me before, it was exhausting having to explain to them over and over why I didn't have Marfan syndrome. I've got a number of features of Marfan syndrome. As you're aware, the genetic testing for the gene that causes Marfan syndrome was totally normal. But, you know, it reached the point where I was so tired of explaining it that I sat down one day and I said, you know what? My heart is really that of somebody who has Marfan syndrome. The mitral valve having had to have been repaired, the location of where my aneurysm was, the size of the aneurysm being less than 5.5 centimeters at the time that it dissected. All of that is very much so. I consider my heart and my aorta to be that of somebody with Marfan, even though, like, deep down on a molecular basis, I don't know that that's true. But there was a point where I just, you know, I gave up, and I'm quite certain that Marfan syndrome is probably in my chart at the hospital because I was so tired of explaining why it wasn't. So, you know, that said, there are criteria for Marfan syndrome. My heart totally meets those criteria. And then with regards to like my body and some of the features and findings with my body, to meet clinical criteria for Marfan syndrome, you need a score of 7 or more. I have a score of 5, which is a strong 4, if I'm being generous, a 5. So I can see why doctors would get a little bit confused about why it's not Marfan syndrome. And I actually had plenty of families over the years that had actually lower body scores than I did, but they had FBN1 gene mutation, and I don't. So, but to see that there were people with Marfan syndrome who looked less the part than me, I can see why providers got confused a little bit about that. But it's really interesting as I look at the things that are going on with me, and then as I look at my family history, like how it all works together. Until I dissected, family members didn't really take any of this seriously. I had a couple of family members that went and got imaging, but one of whom never heard back about the results, and so then they just assumed it was fine. I'm like, no, you got to call. Like, you can't just assume because you didn't hear from them. But after I dissected, especially considering I was 39, so quite young to have an aortic dissection. Then my family finally listened when I said, I want you to go get imaging. And it actually turns out that my dad and both of his sisters have aortic aneurysm in the same exact location that mine was. Mm. However, the size of their aneurysm is similar to what mine was when I was in my early 20s.
Yeah.
And they're in their early 70s. And they've also now been monitored for a number of years. And my understanding is that there really hasn't been like much growth to these aneurysms. That said, a dad and both of his sisters having aortic aneurysm in the same exact spot, it's a piece of the puzzle for sure. But there was always something like, what is different about me? Why was mine younger? Why was mine more progressive? Why did mine tear? What is different about me? And so even though they discovered that on my dad's side, I had my mom go in and get some imaging done as well. And so she's got a nasty mitral valve. It's probably not going to require any sort of intervention, but it's not just like mild mitral valve prolapse. There's some involvement there. And then one of the other things that I haven't mentioned yet is my carotid arteries and some of the arteries in my brain are very tortuous, they're very twisted, which is something that you can see in Loeys-Dietz syndrome.
Right.
And so I've got that, and my mom has that as well. And again, it hasn't required any sort of intervention. It hasn't caused her to have any problems. But I'm looking at this and thinking, oh my gosh, like some of the things that I have going on, I see in both of my parents. And so I'm starting to wonder, is this like one gene that's responsible, or did some genetics, are there multiple genes involved here where I got some genetics from mom and some from dad, and for some reason
that combination
that combined in me and made some of these issues more severe or more progressive or younger. And so that's my theory.
Yeah. It's been a number of years since you've done genetic testing, as you mentioned. Have you considered going for like kind of updated genetic testing, or like whole genome or whole exome, or?
Yeah, something I think about pretty frequently. Right now, I have settled into, I sent a cheek sample in, it's like a saliva, or I can't remember if it was saliva or a cheek swab. I sent something in to Dr. Diana Milowitz to do some research and see if they can't identify a genetic cause for these things in me. And, included, and there's some other stuff in there that's connective tissue-ish for me. Like, I've had to have a CPAP since I was in my mid to late 20s, just because my tubes just kind of collapse when I get relaxed. Like, I stop breathing the second I fall asleep.
Yeah.
And, it's not I'm putting on some pounds now, but it's not a weight issue. Like, I was very thin at the time. And so there's just other connective tissue stuff besides some of the things that I've mentioned. Extremely nearsighted. Like, I'm almost legally blind without my glasses. So there's all sorts of stuff. But so right now I've kind of gone the research route. I suppose, now my imaging is happening like once every other year instead of yearly, but maybe at some point, if I'm real close to meeting my deductible, maybe I'll think about doing like whole genome or whole exome sequencing. As a genetic counselor, obviously I'm very interested in that and what the outcome would look like. But, for the time being, my kids are getting their echoes. I'm stable, and family members have had some imaging as well. So it's not like really an urgent thing for me to get additional clinical genetic testing done quite yet.
Yeah. So, you have this, in some respects, like this is you don't have all the answers, right? And you have, because of your family history in combination with your own medical history, there's some amount of like, I have some kind of unnamed connective tissue disorder maybe, or, it's not the ones that I've been tested for, but I also know this information about myself and I'm doing what I can about it. Is that fair to?
Yeah. It's one of those things where you've got to come to grips with the fact that there are some unknowns. I like to refer to my condition as Ryan syndrome, and maybe if some genes are discovered, maybe I can lobby for it being named after me in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, I've settled into a place where I'm comfortable with the fact that there have been times, like along the way, there are many times where I haven't had all the answers, like the vision loss, and so you just have to kind of grow comfortable with that idea. That's like, don't know what caused this. There may be things I'm at risk for that we're not watching for. That's a possibility. But what we can do is just take what we know about me and the things that I've faced and the things that are going on in my body, take what we know about my family history, and just kind of come up with an educated plan with regards to like management and imaging and what to do for my kids. And I've got providers who are willing to listen to me. It's funny. There are times where I sit down and it's like, I want my providers to be the experts, and I want to ask them questions and have them provide the answers. But I realize at the same time that there aren't good answers. And also for almost 20 years, I was the local expert that they would come to me and ask, what should we do with this family? So my doctor's visits are very much a conversation oftentimes, like, hey, when do you want to do this again? Or when do you want your son or your daughter to have this done? And I'm playing a very active role in figuring out what path we're going to take with regards to our management. So yeah, there are times where I want someone to provide all the answers, and at the same time I realize like that's not where I'm sitting right now. We're not in a place where there are answers. So then you just have to be comfortable and confident that you're making good decisions based on what information is available to you.
Yeah. And how has that affected, I keep wanting to call it your diagnosis, but like your history, like how has that affected your family and your children?
So with regards to my own care, I do occasionally need to raise my voice and say, let's look at different arteries outside of my aorta. I did have that artery in my rib cage rupture during that robotic surgery. Interestingly, there was my dad had a first cousin who died at age 19 and had a brain bleed, and didn't have any other sort of risk factors for that. There wasn't any trauma or any drug use or anything like that. So, you question, like, is that related? So about once every 5 years, I will go to my doctors and say, hey, it's time. Mm-hmm. Let's do a head to toe and just take a look at everything just to make sure we're not missing something. And so I do that about once every 5 years. And again, that's just an educated guess about what we should do.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they're obviously watching my aorta. With my kids, actually my daughter is going to have her first echo this Friday. And, knock on wood, everything looks great there. But, I also, my vision was so poor at her age and like all sorts of stuff that she really doesn't face. So I'm feeling okay about Friday. I know that my wife is not sleeping, and I'm not sleeping great, but I'm feeling okay. I think it's going to look all right. I was a little afraid for my son for a while. He's extremely tall. So this is funny. My dad's 5'7", probably 5'6". I'm 6'1", and my son is pushing 6'5". But what's really interesting is my wingspan is far longer than my son's, and he towers over me. His wingspan is actually shorter than his height, whereas mine is much longer. So there are things like that give me confidence that, maybe he's not like me. My wife would probably argue there are hopefully other reasons why he's not like me. But his aorta measured actually at the high end of normal all through his teen years, and it made me very nervous. It was like right on the verge of being mildly dilated. But then he had this massive growth spurt. Like I said, he's almost 6'5" now, and now his aorta is exactly average. It's like, you don't hope for your kid to be average, but in that regard, you absolutely do. His aorta is very average, and that makes Dad happy.
Yeah.
So he'll probably get an echo at this point. He's 23, so he'll probably get an echo like every 3 years or so. And then my daughter, like I said, her first one is this week. She's 12. We'll probably do it annually until she's 18, 19, like once she's done growing. Yeah. And then we can probably back off a little bit. But for the time being, this is probably something that we'll have to endure once a year as our anxiety goes through this roller coaster ride of like, here comes the echo. Okay, the echo's done.
Yeah.
So that's our plan for now.
Yeah. Do you have advice for somebody else out there listening who is kind of in similar shoes as you, as far as your medical history and like
where there really aren't great answers?
Yeah.
Yeah. Find providers that are willing to listen. Interestingly, you want guidelines to say when you need to get an image done and stuff, but it's like, part of that equation also is like the anxiety of the person sitting in front of you. Like if your patient is very anxious to the point where it's disrupting their life, they're not sleeping, they're not eating, they're struggling at work. Like I think that's reason enough also to like get an image done. So find providers that are willing to listen to you and your circumstances and really to take that into account when they're deciding how to manage you medically, but also like someone who is inquisitive enough to like look at all the details and sort of come up with a custom plan that both of you are comfortable and confident in. There are a lot of providers out there who aren't comfortable coming up with a custom plan if there aren't any guidelines that state this is what you should do. But honestly, like if your insurance covers an image test, despite there not being guidelines to say what to do in this exact specific situation, like if your insurance covers it, then you should have a provider who's willing to do that for you if they've got all sorts of reasons to justify it. So if you've got a provider that doesn't listen or is not willing to stray away from written guidelines, which don't always exist, then I think it's okay to move on and find a different provider that does. And I've said this time and time again, that I would prefer a doctor that admits, you know what, I don't know, I'm going to do some reading, I'll get back to you. I would prefer that provider every day compared to someone who acts like and thinks that they know all of the answers, because even these conditions that at this point we've defined like pretty well, we still don't have all of the answers. So if you've got a provider who acts like they know everything, I would encourage you to think about looking for a second opinion or finding a different provider. So I've had a lot of trial and error relationships with doctors along the way. I don't know if you can tell, but it's worth seeking out somebody else if you don't feel comfortable with your provider, or if you don't feel like they're providing what you need them to provide to you.
Yeah. And it all ties into this like advocating for yourself too. I know that you were talking earlier about how you had to advocate for yourself with the EMTs and the paramedics. Like, no, it's not a AAA. It's my aortic root, any advice you have for advocating for yourself?
Yeah. So I would say first and foremost, know your condition well to the point that you can confidently talk about it. I think there was a point where that paramedic decided, maybe he's not making this up. Maybe he really does know very well what is going on. And because I was persistent and confident in sharing this information with him. And so I would say, number one, absolutely know your condition. And for someone like me, like I don't have a quote unquote a condition, but I knew exactly like the size of my aorta, and I could clearly state the symptoms I was having and how it was impacting my body. And so just know very well and be able to confidently talk about what you're facing, and then also educate those around you. Like there's a possibility that shortness of breath and that anxiety and all of those things could have, the stars could have aligned, and I might have passed out, and I might not have been conscious when somebody came. And so it's very important to have, number one, medical information accessible, like near your front door, hanging on the fridge, but also educate your family members or those around you. Maybe you're in college and you've got roommates and your family can't be there, but educate those around you so that they can equally confidently talk about what you have and what might be going on if 911 is called.
Yeah, that's such important advice, just because emergencies are such a big part of living with these conditions and living with this kind of risk. And you don't have a named condition, right? But you obviously have some degree of family history that's concerning, alongside a known history of aortic dissection. And it's really, really emergencies. Unfortunately, that's sometimes emergency rooms are the first point of care, or 911 and first responders and EMTs are the first point of care. And knowing how to talk about your condition and how to advocate for yourself in those situations is a critical part, I think, of having one of these conditions. And I'm really glad that you highlighted that.
Yeah, I mean, it could mean the difference between getting the imaging that you need versus being sent home because they're not making the correct diagnosis or really believing that it's as urgent of a matter as it is. So, and I go back to that time where I was being told by the neurologists, you're going home, and I hadn't had an echocardiogram. I put my foot in the sand. I'm literally not leaving this hospital until you get an echocardiogram and talk to my cardiologist. And sometimes that's what you need to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't chain myself to the bed or anything, but I was probably really close.
Well, what do you want, medical providers to take away from your story?
First and foremost, listen to the person sitting in front of you and what they are telling you, especially if they have detailed information, like they're saying that they have a known diagnosis. For example, for VEDS in particular, if the person in front of you is saying, I had a sudden pain, whether it be in my abdomen or what have you, if I had a sudden pain, I have VEDS. Like, largely people don't make up a rare diagnosis, right? Like, if someone is saying they have VEDS and the symptom lines up with that diagnosis, listen. And, particularly the VEDS, please don't ask that person to show you how bendy their elbows are. Just get the imaging test done. But yeah, I would just say listen to the person in front of you, and especially if there are like components of their story that fit together and make sense and could explain why they're there, like listen to them and just get that image done. Insurance will pay for it. If you're in the emergency setting and you have a sudden onset of pain, insurance is not going to be an issue. Like, it'll be covered. It'll be approved. Emergency doctors can easily get things approved compared to other physicians. So, I would say just listen to the person and use your brain and put the pieces together and do what that person needs.
Yeah. I know we're nearing the end of our time. What is your favorite thing about directing the VEDS movement?
So I'll be honest. My favorite thing is getting to know people. It was really difficult for me to leave medicine, like I'd said before, and to leave some of my families behind that are living with these conditions. And in my position now, not only have I been able to stay really close to those families that I'd gotten to know and helped to provide genetic counseling for over the years, but I'm meeting so many families that have shared experiences to myself and shared experiences with one another. I'm meeting so many families in this role that I never would have been able to meet or help in any way practicing as a genetic counselor in West Michigan. So, maybe that's a little bit selfish of me, but my favorite part is just getting to know everybody and to know that I, on a larger scale, can help to make a difference for this community. But, number two, I love educating. It was one of those things I always thought, like, maybe I'll be a teacher. And then I would look around at all my classmates who really could not care less about what the teacher was teaching. And that continued all the way through, like, my undergrad. I'm like, this is a place of higher learning. And I'm like looking around at all these kids, like, they don't care what the chemistry professor's talking about. So to find a field and to find work where I can educate, and it makes such an enormous difference. And it is it's an audience that really cares to hear what you're telling or educating them about. Like, I love the education piece of it. And then, the third part is just empowering the community to advocate for themselves as much as I can. I've seen the importance of being able to advocate for yourself along the way on so many occasions that I love being able to empower others to do the same, so that if and when they are in a position where they need to advocate for themselves, that I've helped to provide them the tools to do so.
Yeah.
So I love all that.
Yeah, that's all wonderful stuff. What are your hopes for the future for people with VEDS?
Yeah, so obviously the hope is to find an effective treatment for VEDS. In the interim, I know that we're doing some really good things to lift up the community, provide support. I know that the education advocacy work that we're doing is making a difference. More and more I hear stories that people ran across a provider who knew what they had, and that feels really good to do so. But obviously the end goal is to at some point identify an effective treatment so that we can lower the risks and lower them substantially, and so that families living with VEDS don't have to face what we've seen them have to face all along. So that is obviously what I hope and dream for, is an effective treatment for the VEDS community.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story and giving the listeners an opportunity to hear your story and learn more about you and just get to know you. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Katie. do amazing work. I loved when you started to branch out to some of the other conditions as well. But, it's been really great for me in my role to listen to family stories and to learn a little bit more about some folks that I do interact with. But, there's a difference between, spending a little bit of time emailing back and forth versus hearing an hour-long podcast where we get to hear intimately the details of some of the things they've been through. So I know that so it means a lot to me, but I know that it means a lot for the community. And I really thank you for your work. You're doing a phenomenal job.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode featuring Ryan Rodarmer, sharing his experience with aortic dissection and directing the VEDS movement. If you're ready to meet others, get involved, or need support, there are links for you in the episode show notes, as well as information on research studies for people with VEDS, Marfan, and Loeys-Dietz, including those with a VUS. If you like this show, be sure to share it on social media or give it a rating or review. You can also support the production of this podcast by joining my Patreon, making a one-time donation, or by buying merch. As always, my top-tier patrons are listed in the episode show notes. In the next episode, we'll talk with Tammy Asplund about her story with Loeys-Dietz syndrome. See you soon!